All right, Jeff, we've talked among ourselves for the last few weeks about pitching in baseball and figured we'd get somebody who knows a little bit more than the two of us. Let's bring back on our guy, Jamie Moyer. Uh, Jamie, how you doing, first of all?
I'm doing well, doing really well. We've actually had some great weather up until today, and you'd think that people didn't know how to drive in the rain anymore. We haven't had rain in a while. It's pretty tricky out there today,
Well, we hope
believe it or
every
not.
this is the kind of weather you hated pitching in, right? You'd like a rain out on a day like today.
No, I didn't. As long as they get through me dry balls, I had no problem. If the balls were wet, yeah, then I had a problem.
Well, you've spent, I think, your last year in Colorado. They had a game that snowed out the other day. How'd you like to pitch in snow?
Yeah, that's a little difficult. I mean, the cold, you're not, when it's real cold, things get really dry. Boy, and trying, because, you usually have a little bit of perspiration on your fingers, and if they rub the balls up, you know, this is my recall. Now, again, there's a lot of changes even with the baseball and how they rub up baseballs anymore. So I don't know, but I mean, to me, I didn't like that slick feeling or the dry feeling on the ball because you didn't really have a good sense of feel for the baseball.
Well, we wanted to talk to you about kind of what we're looking at, the change in pitching in baseball and
Mm.
the change in the way people are pitching and what it's doing to their bodies. Before I ask you specific questions, I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on what we're seeing now from pitchers in baseball?
Well, it's unfortunate, but this spike in velocity, for whatever reason they thought there needed to be change, has now created, I think, a large issue not only at the major league level, but I think it's trickled down to even the little league level, unfortunately, right? Because what they see and what they hear, they're going to mimic. And what the coaches and parents see and hear, they're going to try to get information on. And they're not going to, most younger kids are not, and those parents aren't going to a drive line or a company that specifically works in these areas. They're just picking up tidbits of information off the internet and saying, well, my son's throwing harder. Well, your young son has growth plates that are wide open. And your son has not, his body is not developed and his body is not developed to the level that he can even just support basic mechanics. When you're talking 8 to say 14-year-old kids, these kids are quite young. They're growing. You're putting a lot of stress on bodies. And now when you're asking kids to throw as hard as they can, and, I put myself back to those ages. I didn't know where it was going, and I wasn't throwing as hard as I could. Right?
Yeah, and that's, it's been a few years since I coached kids baseball, but even back then, the focus seemed to be on velocity
Mm-hmm.
and curveballs, even when kids
Yeah.
were 10 years old.
Yeah.
Now it's spin
That's
rate.
that's a whole nother can of worms, right? The
Yeah,
curveball and slider.
so now if you're teaching kids at 10 years old and 12 years old, then going into high school, that this idea of throwing as hard as you can and at the same time adding as much spin as you can,
Mm-hmm.
what is it doing to a kid's arm?
Well, I mean, the kids are eventually, if there's consistent use or overuse, the kid's going to break down. His body's going to break down. And look, I mean, you can even look at the dread. I'm gonna jump to a thought that I just had as you were asking that question. Let's go to the high school and college kid now. Okay, who have are it's evident, or I mean, it's factual that kids are getting drafted with clubs knowing they need a surgery or have just had a surgery and they're not able to even to pitch because and then what's happening is organizations are still drafting the kid based on potential, and that's it. They don't know what health is going to be when they're saying, well, we can rehab that. Well, you can rehab that. But I'm a believer that your body is one long chain. Okay. And this is everybody in the world. You were born with one long chain, right?
Right.
And once you break the chain with any kind of a surgery, the chain is broken, right? And yeah, we can weld the chain back together, but is that ever going to be as strong as it was originally? And I'm talking about knees, hips, hamstrings, backs, shoulders, elbows, whatever it might be, any sport. That chain is not going to, you can rehab all you want. The chain is not going to be as strong as it once was. And in a sport like baseball, where as human beings, we're not necessarily made to throw overhand with a lot of, continual and a lot of stress. It's really interesting. You don't hear anything about Tommy John surgeries in fast pitch softball, do you?
No.
Right? Because that's a natural motion. Okay. The underhand, fast pitch softball, that's a natural motion. The overhand throw of a baseball is an unnatural motion. And, from my recall of, playing in the major leagues, even, college, whatever it might be, when you're throwing overhand, they use the word micro tears, right? You get micro tears in your arm and your body can recover from those micro tears. However, I gotta believe when there's overuse and again, poor mechanics. Again, let's bump back to those kids again that I was referring to, 8 to 14-year-olds. To me, your biggest muscles in your body go from your knees to, say, your sternum. Those are the biggest muscles in your body, and I'm a believer that any sport you play works off of those bigger muscles, right? And your arms and your legs are just levers that you use to work in unison with those big muscles. And, I'm not a science guy. I'm not a doctor. I'll never claim, and I won't be making predictions. I'll never make those predictions because that's out of my space. However, after pitching 4,000 innings in the major leagues, I think I have a little bit of an idea. And, for me, for those younger kids, say we'll start in middle school and high school, I'd have those kids on an arm program and call it prehab, right? What happens after surgery, we call it rehab. Now, if we're doing it beforehand, we're calling it prehab, and we're teaching those kids how to take care of their arms, right? And especially for me as an organization, I'd be putting all my prospects on a prehab program. Right.
Yeah, but you also mentioned not just the arm there. You mentioned the legs. And what I remember is as a kid watching Nolan Ryan, watching Tom Seaver, watching Jim Palmer, then watching you as you came up in the majors, and so many of those other pitchers is the legs were as important.
Yes, they are.
Developing power and as part of your motion as your arm was. And I don't see pitchers now using their legs. You don't see them driving towards and building up those legs. Is that one of the many reasons that you were able, and so many of your generation of pitcher were able to pitch without these kinds of injuries because it was the entire body and not just the arm?
The injuries were there. I mean, Nolan Ryan had a fair amount of injuries over the course of his career, but he was able to deal with it and come back from that. And yeah, your legs are important. Yes. And guys are training. And yes. And, I don't want to make it sound like, this era of players doesn't work out, but the workouts are completely different from what I've seen. I happen to be fortunate enough to be a pitching coach for the Futures game last year in Seattle before the All-Star game and the high school All-American All-Star game. And, all these kids came walking out with these weighted baseballs, right? Which I have no idea. That was not part of the era that I played in, right? So again, I'm not here to condone it, but that was and they're throwing these weighted balls against the wall in the outfield, and that's how they're warming up. Now these kids, they're bigger, they're stronger, they throw harder. I mean, they're unbelievable looking specimens. It's funny. I talked to an old pitching coach of mine about a week ago, and he's like, he was saying, I was talking to a friend of mine previously who was in the game, and he goes, there's not an ounce of fat on these pitchers anymore. Everybody's body is really, really, really lean, right? And, I think there's something to that. I don't know the science behind that, but I think there's a happy medium there. I mean, look at CC Sabathia. CC Sabathia pitched most of his career at a pretty heavy weight and was quite durable, right? And again, I'm not saying that if you're in shape, you're going to get hurt. But what I'm saying, there's a happy medium here. And I don't, from what I know of, as you go to a spring training, a major league spring training, these pitchers are being trained to throw 100 pitches, and that's it, right? Because they're going max effort. Well, why is the number 100? Why isn't it 80? Why isn't it 110? Maybe 100 is too much if you're asking max effort for guys. Well, I don't have that, those answers, but you see guys breaking down. Like you said, maybe 100 is too much. Maybe it should be 75.
Well, and you talk about them breaking down. I mean, if I'm baseball, I'd be concerned. You look at the stats, 37% of all active pitchers have had Tommy John surgery. So you talk about that max effort and the change in pitching. Did you ever told before a game, like, this is your pitch count? You're going to be out after this? Or it was, well, you'll see how your body,
as I got older, it became a little more prevalent, but not hugely prevalent. But see, as at the very end of my career, I think they started counting pitches, and you were having some of these younger players come up who were starting this. What we're seeing now. It was starting to evolve in the game, and I would tell my pitching coach, I'd say, "Look, I'm no longer a prospect. I don't know if I was ever a prospect." I said, but I'm a suspect now. So to me, it doesn't matter, right? How many pitches I'm throwing. If you want to protect your younger guys, that's fine. I'm 40-some years. I'm 47, 48, 49 years old. You don't need to protect me. The gate's open to the pasture, and I've got, 2 legs out into the pasture already. So I'm just hanging on because I, feel like I can compete and bring something to your ball club.
Well, and you see the impact on the game. I mean, you had almost like a decade in a row where you averaged over 200 innings. Last year, there were 5 pitchers who threw 200 innings. So it's not just the max velocity. It's how many innings they're going in a game and how that's changing everything too.
Well, and it's putting more stress on your bullpen. My take on it, if you're playing 162 games, take 162 times 9, and I believe it's like 1,400 and some odd innings, right? That have to be pitched during the course of a season, give or take a few innings, right? And, the way I was raised in the game, starting pitchers, if you're getting your 30 to 32, 33 starts a season, should be able to pitch 200 innings. So if you got 5 guys pitching 200 innings, boy, you're taking, the bulk of the innings are being taken on by your starting rotation. Now you don't have to put as many meaningless innings on your bullpen. So then when you ask or you want or are asking your bullpen guys to be sharp, they are sharp because they're not being overused. But now they've got 7, 8-man bullpens?
Yeah.
Right? So now what happened, utility players, I got to believe, have been pushed out of the game somewhat.
Well, and you have 6-man starting rotations in a lot of places. I mean, the Phillies this weekend, when Taijuan Walker comes back, there will only be 3 more teams in baseball that have had 5 starters this year.
Right. And, that won't last. I think, I don't remember the year it was, but it was in the early 2000s in Seattle. We had 5 starters make every start. And I believe that was the first time it happened since like the 40s. So that's something that, will not happen. And I think these organizations prepare 7, 8, 9, potential 10 starters during the course of the season, knowing they know that they're not going to have 5 guys make every start.
There's been some discussion with retired pitchers now that one of the problems is the pitch count. Is that pitchers now know this is where I'm going out of a game, so I'm going to give max effort until I go out of the game. Where if you don't know when you're going out of the game, was your mentality was I need to preserve myself, I need to pick my spots so that I could go as far as I can, as opposed to the pitchers now that say, I know I'm not facing a batter on the third time around.
Right. Well, I don't know. I don't think I ever used the word preserve, but my feeling was if I could pitch at 80 to 90%, somewhere in that range, let's pick a number 85%, or even 90%. If I pitch at 90%, now look, I wasn't a high velocity guy, right? So for me to go, now I can climb up in the zone and throw it by somebody, I could do that every now and then. I couldn't do that consistently.
Right.
But, for me, if you're pitching at 90%, it's easier to add and you can subtract. But if you're pitching at 100%, how do you add to 100%? So you're taking away a potential weapon. You see what I'm saying? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, because you can't change. You can only change speeds in one direction.
Right. And you're also seeing, it's a great point or question that you asked, Jeff. If you're also seeing guys throw more breaking balls than fastballs. I mean, you can go back to probably the 90s, 80s, 70s, 60s, 50s, 40s. The fastball, everything worked off the fastball, right? And you were probably seeing guys throwing 60, 65, 70% fastballs in a game. You don't see that anymore in today's game. It would be interesting to find out what stat that number is. I would bet it might be 50, 55, 57% fastballs and everything else is breaking ball.
You even see it when they start the broadcast of the game. They show what the pitches are, and they'll show you how they break them down, and they value diversity in pitches, it seems. I did want to ask you, MLBPA and some people have kind of blamed the pitch clock, separate from the velocity and everything else. It's saying, pitchers have less time to recover, they speed up, they get out of rhythm. What are people saying to you about the pitch clock, and what are your thoughts on the impact?
I don't know that the pitch clock really has that much of a play in this personally. As far as recovery, look, I've never been, I can be honest, I've never been the guy that pitched at max effort, and I don't know. So it's hard for me to speak on that, because I've never experienced that. I do know that there were times in my career, if I tried to reach back and throw as hard as I could, I knew I had not the location that I needed. But if you're used to pitching at max effort, you're going to figure it out. And look, I think that box that they put up on the TV screen, I've heard people say that it's not 100% accurate. But you got guys pitching to that box, right? And, I honestly don't know. I mean, to me, when you're pitching, the hitter's dictating what you're throwing, right? And to a certain extent, you know what you have, you know what you don't have, you know what you can be competitive with, you know what your out pitch is or out pitches are. You're going to try to set up a hitter to get him out or to get him, to tie him up, to catch a swing deep back or to get him out front. To me, that's pitching. What we're seeing today is throwing. And, and I also I jokingly, I call it gladiator baseball.
And that was going to be my question to you. Is the art of pitching as we know it gone or on its way? Is it becoming a dinosaur?
There's a few guys out there that still pitch, but for the most part, and there's some hard throwers.
Mm-hmm.
Verlander, Skeens, I'm sure he's an awfully talented guy. We haven't seen him pitch at the major league level yet, but he sure is dominating at the minor league level. But how long can his body take this load, right? And I hope he goes his whole career and he never has an injury. I'd never wish an injury on anybody. But what we're seeing is it does catch up. And then, it's how many innings are you pitching under duress? That isn't a big marker for me too. Like if you're pitching 5 innings and 4 of the innings that you pitched, you're under duress, that's a different outing than say throwing 95 pitches and you're kind of sailed through the game.
What are your thoughts on the focus?
Duress takes its toll.
What are your thoughts on some of the focus on the newer pitches? You talked about the off speed, the sweeper, the power changeup, the impact on the pitchers with those types of pitches that they're trying to throw.
Well, I mean, I think they're just trying to create new. They're basically the same pitches. They're just giving them different names.
Is that what it is?
That's how I look at it. Yeah, you mean you can't tell me some of these guys in the 50s and 60s didn't throw a sweeper?
They just didn't name it.
They just gave it. Yeah, they called it a curveball. So I mean, that's we're trying to just put a different spin on things, right?
Yep.
And look, we're trying to make the game more towards the younger crowd, the younger generation. Baseball has gotten younger. What's the average age in baseball today versus 20 years ago? I'll bet it's 5, 6, 7, 8, maybe 9 years younger. How many? I look back in the eras that I played in. There weren't many kids coming up at 19 years old, 20 years old. Now every team has a couple.
But isn't that out of necessity, especially for pitching? Is there ever, you pitched, I believe, 26 years in the major leagues.
Something like that.
Is there ever the way that these pitchers pitch, somebody that's going to pitch 20 years ever again?
No.
And if you don't have pitchers that can pitch into their 30s consistently, then the necessity is you're going to have to start bringing people up younger and younger.
Yeah, that's for sure. And look, it takes longer. The way it sounds, it's taken longer for these harder throwers to recover.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you go back in the 90s, 80s, and 70s, I can't relate to the 70s, but the 90s and 80s, relief pitchers, most would had the ability to throw 3 days in a row. You don't see guys in today's relievers throwing 3 days in a row.
They barely throw back to back sometimes. Right.
Well, and now you got 8 guys in a bullpen. So a manager's job is, how do I keep these guys fresh? Right. Back, in those times that I'm talking about, you had a 6-man bullpen, sometimes even a 5-man bullpen. Right. And then and sometimes some teams I've been on some teams that carried 3 catchers. Right. That's unheard of. You're not,
that is completely unheard of at this point.
Right. And you put more emphasis on your utility players. And now you've got a DH in both leagues. So that, that's, is a little different too.
All right. Well, Jamie, we do appreciate your time, but before you go, we certainly miss watching you pitch, and we miss.
Well, I miss pitch. My body doesn't, but I do.
What do you most miss about playing the game?
Well, obviously, and I think everybody gives us probably the same answer across the board. Number one is competition. We all love to compete, right? Regardless of what your talent level is, you're out there to compete. Playing on a team, preparing individually, preparing as a group, and then put a winning effort together. Now I can say that I played on a World Series champion to go from spring training all the way through a season and see that full circle. That's to me is a huge organizational accomplishment, right? Yeah, there's many individual accomplishments with that, but it takes a lot for a team to win a World Series. It's not that easy. A Super Bowl, an NBA, any championship, it's not easy. And there's a lot of things that come up during the course of a season, not only on the playing field, but off the field, right? And, we're also dealing with human beings that have a life off the field and families and things come up off the field. So there can be a lot of distraction. But the responsibility of preparing, being healthy, contributing, to me, those are all wonderful things of being on a team. And I miss that part of it. Right. And that's the fun part of it. And the the great thing with it all, there's no guarantees with it. You're just doing it, right?
Well,
because you have passion for it and you love it.
Well, we've talked to some of your teammates from those 2007, 2008 teams, and they're more than any other players we've ever spoken with. There's something about that team that was special. It wasn't just that you won a World Series. It seemed like you all just enjoyed being around each other.
Oh, heck yeah. And I honestly, I share this story that it started in 2007 when, we got boat raced by the Colorado Rockies in the first round of the playoffs. And that left such a bitter taste with that ball club that in 2008, walking in the door in spring training, it was a totally different mindset with that club. Now, did we know we were going to go to the World Series and win a World Series? No, we didn't. But I would believe every person you asked that was there in 2007 and 8 would feel like, or mention that we had unfinished business. And, the Rockies upset the apple cart for us in 2007. And we had something to prove. And I think we went out and did it.
Look, we appreciate you taking the time to tell us that part of the story, but also to break down the changes in pitching, because there's so much going on that we needed somebody who's been there and who's done that to tell us all about it. Jamie Moyer, thank you so much for the time.
I appreciate you having me on, and I guarantee you everybody's going to have their own opinion and their own thoughts. It's going to be interesting for me to watch this and see how it shakes itself out and how baseball deals with it and how the players actually deal with it. I think, unfortunately, all the players have bought into this velocity thing because it's allowing them to have a job, right? If you're at 86 miles an hour, you don't have a job. You're not even being scouted anymore, right?
The problem is you may have a job, but not a career.
And they only have a job as long as they're healthy.
Exactly. I hear you. I hear you. There's a ton of college pitchers and high school pitchers that will not get drafted this year that could be very good major league pitchers, but they'll never get the opportunity because they don't, they're not lighting up the radar gun or their spin rates aren't where they need to be. And that's what's unfortunate for me.
Well, we'll watch where it goes as much as you, and as things change, We'll look forward to talking to you again. Thanks so much for the time.
All right. Thanks for having me on.